was an assumption that you would go to university, which I can't recall ever having questioned, even though my mother never went to university. You can tell from my accent that I'm Canadian. My mother was born and grew up in Blackpool, England, in a council house flat, and for her, going to university was never an option or in the cards. In fact, she left school at 16. And my father was born in Poland, in a Jewish shtetl, but his parents took him to Montreal in Canada when he was 3 years old. And in the Jewish immigrant community, going to university is just what you do. It's just not an option not to. So my mother converted to Judaism when she married my father, and for as long as I can recall, there was just an absolute assumption that every member of the family, I was the eldest I am the eldest of three, would go to university. So I can't honestly remember a time when I didn't just assume that that's what I would do. So prior to going to university, I was a very good student. I did very well academically. I would have been in the top 3% of my high school graduating class. I was valedictorian in my high school. I had the Girls' Award of Honor. I was a bit of one of those. And for the most part in high school, it came to me quite easily. I didn't actually have to work that hard, and I got very good grades. And I just assumed that that's what was going to continue thereafter. So engineering was a rather big shock to my system. And I realized that the step up from high school to university was much more significant than I had anticipated. Both the quality of the academic quality of the students who were in classes with me was quite different, but the challenge academically was really quite radically different in engineering from what I had experienced previously. So I continued to do well in some courses in first year, but I really struggled with others, and I found that really, really hard. And it didn't get that much better. Engineering is a 4-year degree in Canada, and in fact the challenge for me got worse as those years went on. And for someone who'd found it quite easy to get good grades without working hard, the opposite was true. I was working all the hours God could send, and my grades were pretty average, and in some cases below average. So that was a really significant adjustment for me in terms of my self-image of myself, because I'd always thought of myself as one of the smartest kids in the class, and all of a sudden that just wasn't true. And of course in engineering, we were less than 15% of the class. So as a woman, you were also in a significant minority with your classmates. Don't think I felt like a failure, but I did feel like my self-image was shifting pretty dramatically, and the stress of not doing well was pretty unpleasant, I think it's safe to say. And again, having grown up in a household where doing well in school was just a given, was a clear expectation. So I'd been the kind of student who used to rush home with my report card and give it to my parents, and all of a sudden I wasn't showing them my university transcripts at all because the grades were so much less strong than I was used to and I had wanted. I think they were pretty tough years for me, those years. More importantly, at some level, I both found it really, really hard intellectually, academically. More significantly, I didn't enjoy it. I wasn't enjoying what I studied. So in addition to recognizing that I was no longer the person academically that I thought I had been, I was also struggling with the fact that what I had thought was a possible career trajectory for me was unlikely to bring me much life satisfaction. My father was a civil engineer who had his own business, and so part of my rationale for going into engineering was that I would join him and run the family business with him. It was a small business, but it was was doing well and very well respected and profitable. And I used to work for my father during the summers when I was studying engineering. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend working in a small office with your father, particularly if you recognize that you're struggling with some of the taking on board the concepts that are pretty fundamental to doing that job well. So a lot of my time that I was in engineering, I was trying to figure out what am I going to do next. And I had always had an interest in law and had thought that I might do a law degree after engineering, but I was really struggling to figure out how I would tell my father that that was what I was thinking of doing. But as time went on, it became clearer and clearer to me that a future career in engineering was not only not in the cards for me, but wouldn't necessarily be safe for most of the rest of the population. I wouldn't want to be on a bridge that I built, put it that way. There were a few academics who I spoke to who helped put it all in context for me and not make when you're in a difficult period academically or otherwise, there's a tendency to think this is the end of the world and to not over dramatize it, but overestimate its impact on your life and forget about all the other good things that are going on in your life. And I had a couple of academic lecturers who I went to when I was really struggling, who were really kind to me and really encouraging. And even though at that stage I was doubting my own intellectual capacity, they didn't. So they could see that I was smart, but that I was really struggling to apply my type of intelligence to the practical world of engineering and physics in particular. It just wasn't happening. That's not really terribly good if you're in civil engineering. So it was nice that other people saw something in me that at that stage of my life I didn't see myself. I was in a long-term relationship at that time with a boyfriend who was tremendously encouraging and supportive. And it was partly about reminding yourself that you're smart even when you don't feel smart at all. And it was then when I realized and took the decision that I wasn't going to make a career for myself in engineering that the weight of the world came off my shoulders. Because then it mattered. I still wanted to do well, but it mattered much less that I wasn't doing well so long as I could get into law school. Because by then I realized that was going, I didn't realize, I was really hopeful that that was going to be a much more satisfying career direction for me and that I would find it much easier academically, and both of those things turned out to be true. 4 years of engineering, a lot goes on in your personal life and a lot goes on in your academic life and in your social life with friends. And for me, there was a period in which it all came crashing down. So my long-term boyfriend and I broke up. Things weren't going well at school. It was probably not far from the time that I told my parents that I wasn't going to finish my degree. So there were a couple of months when I was rock bottom. And in a sense, I almost had no choice but to tell some of my lecturers because I'd stopped attending classes and I wasn't handing work in. So I needed to go and have a conversation with someone or things were going to get much worse. At that time, the main trigger was the breakup with the boyfriend, which really didn't go terribly well. And I had to move house. We were living together. It was just messy, ugly, ghastly, horrible. And so I had a couple of conversations with the lecturers who I found the most approachable. And as I said, they were incredibly, once I had that conversation, got up the nerve to go and see them, they were much more supportive than I'd anticipated. And clearly they were all men because all of my lecturers were male throughout 4 years of engineering. But some of them had daughters and some of them were just very empathetic. I think I spoke with about 3 of them, and that made a huge, huge difference. Yeah, it was not one of the most pleasant conversations I'd ever had, and it took me a while to lead up to it. What I did was I wrote, in Canada, there's a standardized entrance test that you take to get into law school, which is called the LSAT. And I wrote the LSAT around Christmas of my 3rd year of engineering. And because my grades in engineering were relatively average, looking at them in their most positive light. I knew I had to do really, really well on the LSAT to stand any chance of getting into law school, because they don't actually take into account the fact that engineering is a harder degree. There are pretty strict standards for getting into law school in Canada. So I wrote the LSAT, and I was fortunate to do very, very well. And so I didn't know for sure I'd get into a law school, but I knew I'd put myself in a position where I was likely to get into, there's about 10 law schools in Canada, I was likely to get into at least one or two. So I told my parents just after Christmas, after I got the results of the LSAT. And to some extent, I think my father wasn't entirely surprised. He was very disappointed, and there was a bit of a I told you so about it all. But I then decided I was going to finish the engineering degree. So I could have just ditched it then and gone to law school after 3 years of engineering, but I was clear to myself and to my parents that I wanted to finish the degree. And I think that made all of us feel a little bit better. It was a hard thing to do, a final year of a very, very tough program when you knew it wasn't the career you were going to pursue, but I was pretty clear with myself that having started something, I wanted to finish it. But the last year, so it was hard on the one side, but on the other hand, I knew that I was going to go to law school afterwards. So that made things much easier. I knew that was just the final stage. And that final year, because I was able to take more electives and choose things that interested me more, in the end wasn't as bad as it might have been. Yeah, but the funny thing is that happened when I was in law school rather than in engineering. So I'd gone from, as an engineering student in Canada, you have something close to 30 contact hours a week. Between lectures, seminars, tutorials, and labs, your schedule is fully booked. And of course, you're having to do a lot of prep for each of those assignments almost weekly. So I worked my tail off. I pulled all-nighters as a regular part of my study approach, which I wouldn't recommend, I have to say, but there was no other way I was going to get through. I then went to law school, and it's 15 contact hours a week, which is standard in North American universities. And yeah, you have to read to prepare for each law lecture, but the relative demands of the two programs were miles apart. So I went to law school and thought this was the easiest thing I'd ever done. I didn't know initially whether I was going to do well, because it takes a while before you get any assessment results. But I did find myself slipping into a mode where I was watching soap operas during the day, which is unheard of. And I still look back at that and think, what was I thinking? And eventually I got a part-time job. I had so much time on my hands, I just needed to find a way to keep myself busy, because otherwise I wasn't even doing my schoolwork. And in law, because assessments, typically it's a 100% final exam for depending on the course, either a one-term course or a full-year course. So it's really easy to fall into a pattern where you're not doing the readings and you're not absorbing the material, but if you allow that to go on for too long, you hit final exams where you've got 5, they're each a 3-hour exam, most of them 100%, and most of them a closed book. So you have to have memorized everything that you were supposed to have known in that course. So I did fall into that lazy spell a bit in first year, and paid a huge price for it as I went into my final year exams. I still did okay because I'm quite an accomplished crammer, but I did realize that I couldn't afford to do that in second and third year, because it would just be way too risky. Certainly when I was a student in university, absolutely not. I wouldn't have had any idea that this job even exists. I knew nothing about university administration. And that would have been true not only through my engineering degree and my law degree, but I then practiced as a lawyer. And then for various bizarre reasons, ended up getting a job working in a law school at McGill University in Montreal. But even then, I thought I would do that for a couple of years and then go back to being a lawyer. But life sometimes takes you in different directions, and I've been working in university administration ever since then. I would say that some of the steps in that career were fairly logical and I could have anticipated, but there were two really big jobs I got that I was stunned and surprised to get. Don't don't tell anyone. But this is one of them. But I was also the registrar and the director of recruitment and admissions at McGill a long time ago now, when I was a relatively young woman. And again, sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time, and you make the right impression on the right people, and you get a job that really, logically, no one should ever think about giving you. And I've been fortunate twice in my career to have been in the right place at the right time. You still then have to deliver, so once you've been given that opportunity, you have to prove that you deserved it. But life takes you in odd directions, and sometimes it's worth taking risks because you never really know what might happen.